Everybody ready? Camera screens.
I think history is a lot more effective if you argue by implication. If you tell somebody they're just wrong, they're probably not going to listen to your next sentence. And so, to me, the goal is, here are moments in history that have felt like the one we're in, and here's how we got out of them. And to me, the American story is the story of more generously applying what Jefferson meant when he wrote that all men are created equal. We don't build monuments to people who limit that definition. We don't commemorate holidays for people who decided to constrict access to the American mainstream. We celebrate, rightly, people who broaden the definition, who open doors, who open their arms. And that sounds partisan today, which tells us more about ourselves than anybody else, but it's not partisan. It's simply, I think, a clinical reading of the very human mess of history. The American story is full of violence and oppression, but it's also full of peace and liberation. All history comes out of conflict, whether it's racial or class or economic or political, tribal. That's inevitable. We live in a fallen world. We don't live in a perfect world. We don't live in a place where people come together and say, how can we make things better because that's the right thing to do? We live in a world where there are clashes of interests, there are winners and there are losers, and the moments that speak to us most are not the ones that feel Olympian and distant, but which feel messy, complicated, contingent, close run. We would think, for instance, that the Civil War should have been the beginning of a great new era, right? 750,000 Americans die, abolition is achieved, the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments are passed. This is the beginning of a new modern era. But 5 minutes after Appomattox, 5 minutes after Lee's surrender, the reaction sets in. And that's the story of the country, is a couple of steps forward, step or two back. You just hope that by the time all the steps are counted, we're a few more ahead than we are back. We live in a world that is sinful and disappointing, and a world in which tragedy is far more often the state of things than a kind of comic conclusion. There's a reason Shakespeare's tragedies are performed more often, really, than his comedies, because I think they speak to us more. We're all more familiar with heartbreak than we are with heart fulfillment, and that's the nature of reality. The Constitution was written for moments like this. It was written with an understanding that we are frail and fallen and given to appetite and ambition, and that we have to, as the Federalist Papers said, have to have ambition to counteract ambition. If we don't look the world in the eye, if we don't take account of our own tendency to do the wrong thing, then the thinking we do to try to set up our public affairs won't be particularly effective, because people are going to do what they want to do. The greatness of America, in many ways, lies in the fact that we've created a system where the founders assumed we would do the wrong thing most of the time. We have not disappointed them. Winston Churchill once said, you can always count on the Americans to do the right thing once they've exhausted every other possibility, and that's what we do. And so I very much have a theological understanding of the nature of people and the nature of the country, which is in fact the same. A nation is only the fullest expression of the individual dispositions of heart and mind of all of us. And if we can get to doing the right thing 51% of the time in a given day as people, that's a hell of a good day. I don't make it very much. And the country's the same way, because the country is the sum of its parts. I can see why people would think that a message from a boringly heterosexual white Southern man to relax, it's all going to be fine, would be annoying, would be off-putting. I've never been oppressed. I am part of a gender and a class that has had things work out most of the time. But if people like me don't speak up, it seems to me that's unilaterally disarming in the struggle. To me, the message of hope is rooted in history. It's not coming out of a vision, some sort of ethereal vision of, I would like the world to be this way. It's based on how the world has been. The experiment, which was based on this understanding that people were going to get things wrong more often than they get them right, has in fact been worth protecting and perpetuating. And I think I'm right. I really do, because if you had grabbed an American in 1866 and said, how are things going? Well, if you were a formerly enslaved person in the American South, things weren't going very well. You had the Ku Klux Klan on the march. You had the South trying to resist the implications of the verdict of the Civil War. If you were an Irish immigrant in New England and you were being told you didn't need to apply for a job because we don't hire Irish Catholics because we think Roman Catholicism is what people today would call Sharia law. If you were an Asian immigrant in California and you had a United States senator in Washington say that we were worried that there was going to be a yellow Asiatic empire from California to the Rockies, that's not a great moment. Nobody ever sat around at a moment in the past and said, wow, everything is perfect. If only everything could stay exactly this way. We're always questing. We're always wanting more. And sometimes you do that from a position of power. Sometimes you do it from a position of powerlessness. We all know what the American ideal is. It's fair play, it's liberty under law, it's equal opportunity, it's what Lincoln called a fair chance for your industry, intelligence, and enterprise. We can all agree on that. If you wake people up in the middle of the night and say, what's the ideal of America? That's what they'll say. We're equal, we're home, land of the free, home of the brave. But the question becomes, how do you make the ideal real? And that's why I talk about the soul of the country, because in Hebrew and in Greek, soul means breath or life. The pagan world understood that there was an essence to who we were. And my view is that the soul of the country, you have your better angels on one side, and you have your worst instincts on the other. And every moment, every era is shaped by the battle between those two forces. In Reconstruction, all the forces that continue to shape us, anxiety about race, anxiety about class, anxiety about power, shaped and suffused the era. So you come out of 1865, we think that it's a new world. We think that we've adjudicated the great question that had bedeviled the American founding, which is the role of slavery and enslavement in American life. And we find that actually there's still an enormous amount of racial animus that finds expression in law and in custom. People were not in fact willing to apply the entire meaning of the Declaration to everybody, even though we just fought a war over that question. Whether it's states' rights or telling the government to stay out of your business or all those touch points that continue to shape our politics, were on vivid display from 1866 really through the 1920s. You had a Supreme Court rule in Plessy versus Ferguson, the separate but equal was a constitutional principle. You had the Ku Klux Klan rioting and committing vigilante violence. You had an American president, Andrew Johnson, who was unstable, egotistical, appealed to the worst in us and not the best. Any of this sound familiar? You know, as Mark Twain is alleged to have said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. All of those forces are in play in America in the wake of the Civil War. The white resistance to the implications of the Civil War, that in fact the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were the law of the land. We had decided that Jefferson's assertion that all men were created equal applied in fact to all men regardless of color. There was immediate pushback on that. In 1865, a Confederate journalist named Edward Alfred Pollard wrote a book called The Lost Cause, in which he defined the cause of white supremacy as the new abiding concern of the southern states. So we've gone from slavery to supremacy. It's a difference of degree, but it's not a difference of kind. It was Palm Sunday, 1865, April 1865. General Lee is surrendering the Army of Northern Virginia to Ulysses S. Grant. They meet at Wilmer McLean's house at Appomattox Courthouse, a village in Virginia. And if history were a fairy tale, this would be the moment at which we all lived happily ever after. the Army of Rebellion, the secessionist movement that had cost so much blood, so much toil, so much treasure, was ending peaceably. Lee goes and with dignity surrenders. Grant goes and with dignity and grace accepts the surrender. And that should be, if this were a movie, the moment at which then flowers spring and the sun comes out and the music swells. But it didn't. It didn't. White supremacy replaced slavery as the consuming concern of white Southerners. Lee did not leave Appomattox to return to a South that was willing to accept the implications of the defeat. He returned to a South that wanted to keep fighting under a different flag, although sometimes the same flag, for a slightly different cause. But the essence was the same. The essence was, no, we don't think that all men are created equal. We don't think that. We say we do, but in point of fact, we're not going to act that way. And we're going to set up laws, we're going to set up governments in the southern states, a huge part of the country, that is going to put segregation and racially based discrimination in law and custom. We're not interested in a new birth of freedom, as Lincoln put it. What we're interested in is preserving our way of life as best we can since we lost. That's the Southern view. That view continues to shape the understandings of an enormous number of folks 150 years on. The Lost Cause was an attempt by the white South to give some meaning to their defeat, some explanation of their defeat, and then to give the future a shape as well. And so suddenly the South didn't lose because they were wrong. The South, in this view, lost because they were outgunned and outmanned, and the pure brute strength of the North is what led to the Southern defeat. It wasn't a moral failing, it was a material one. And if it's not a moral failing, then you have the excuse to continue to try to live under that system of law and custom. The Lost Cause was the origin myth, in many ways, of the 20th century South, and to some extent the 21st century South. The people who in the 1960s were resisting the implications of the Supreme Court decision about school integration, the people in the 1960s who were resisting the federal government's attempts to undo Jim Crow, were all acting as if they were the last stand, the last battalion in the Civil War. That, in fact, the Civil War had not ended at Appomattox. The Civil War was simply taking a different form and continuing to unfold. The task that was before Grant and before Lincoln and then before Andrew Johnson is almost unimaginable in its complexity, because as much as we want the North to be, as Robert Penn Warren said, to be a virtuous region, it was driven by racial questions as well. It was driven by and shaped by a sense of racism. If the cause was union, then what Grant was trying to do was create terms that would bring the Union back together as quickly and seamlessly as possible. Where things got complicated real fast was the North was in many ways shaped by racism, as was the South, and they were attempting a social revolution on the back of a military victory, which is very hard to do. And what Grant knew and what Lincoln knew was that the Union would have to endure and was to endure. And if it were going to do that, then we were neighbors again. And so to be harsh toward the South, to be punitive toward the South, would create more chaos in peacetime and a kind of quasi-military struggle that would continue after the full military struggle. You know, Harry Truman once said, "Heroes always know when to die." And Abraham Lincoln, in a weird way, knew when to die. It's impossible to know whether he would have made a better success of Reconstruction. My own bet is that he would have, because what you saw with Lincoln was someone who was self-evidently changing and growing as president. If you go back and read the first inaugural, he says, look, to the southern states, you have nothing to fear from me if you're a slaveholding state. But he got to emancipation. The last statements he made on Reconstruction were more conciliatory, but faced with a recalcitrant South, would he have conducted a policy that was ultimately more effective? Would it have been a policy that protected the civil liberties that had been so hard fought in the war? My own bet is yes, but it's a mystery of history. Andrew Johnson's conduct of Reconstruction in many ways was the last Southern battle of the Civil War. He was doing everything he could to reverse the verdict that had been reached on the battlefield. He vetoed civil rights bills. He opposed the 14th Amendment, which provided equal protection under law. He did everything he could to return the country as much as he could to an antebellum way of being. And he did so not least because he was a white Southerner. That was his constituency. He was not a Republican. He'd been put on the ticket in 1864 to balance out a wartime election ticket. Imagine if you had a Republican president who dies and then a Democratic president comes in and in our own terms starts passing Medicare for all and high tax rates after the Republican who'd won the election had run on an opposite platform. That's kind of where we were. See if any of this sounds familiar. Andrew Johnson was an unconventional American president who had come to ultimate power by an unconventional route. He did not have a natural political constituency in Washington, and he believed very much that he needed to govern for his narrow base of supporters and not for the country as a whole. There's a long time debate about who really won the Civil War. It's a little facetious, but the South got a really good deal out of the war. Perhaps the best way to put it is the North won the war, but the South won the peace. And it created a century or more of essentially an antebellum way of life in the South. Segregation replaced slavery. Separate but equal replaced human enslavement. But that was the way the world was going to be for well over 100 years. It's 100 years from Appomattox to the Voting Rights Act, almost exactly. The Voting Rights Act was proposed, and the great energy behind it came in March of 1965. Appomattox was April 1865. You had an entire century where the Southern vision of race relations was largely predominant over what you would have thought would have been the implications of the verdict of the war. You look at Charlottesville in 2017, neo-Nazis, Klansmen marching around. That is precisely, at least in terms of the Klansmen, what the world looked like in 1866-67. You have people who are resisting the verdict, resisting the tide of history in order to stand up for a racially defined, divisive way of life. And the fact that in the 21st century, people calling themselves Klansmen are in Charlottesville, Virginia, the home of Robert E. Lee, not far from Appomattox, basically fighting for an antebellum vision of the world is a remarkable thing. But it's not all that remarkable if you know American history. And if you know that 5 minutes after Appomattox, people were trying to figure out, all right, we lost the big one, how can we win the smaller ones? Confederate journalist, writer Edward Alfred Pollard writes this book called The Lost Cause. He writes it in 1865. It's published in January of 1866, so not even a year after Appomattox, saying that we now have to embrace this new war for white supremacy. He followed it up with another book 2 years later. He talked about a war of ideas. He talked about the fact that we meaning the white South, had to resist the encroachments of a consolidated government, which is what they would have called big government. He totally framed this idea of an acceptable resistance to the full implications of what the Civil War, after emancipation and after Gettysburg, had been about. Lincoln said this is about a new birth of freedom. This is about the enslaved people being forever free. Pollard and others say, no, we don't accept that. What we're going to do is fight a rearguard action decade to decade to decade, saying that our way of life, a way of life based on skin color and exclusion, is going to carry the day no matter what happened at Antietam or Gettysburg or Appomattox. The Lost Cause was very much about big government versus states' rights. It was very much about Washington versus the rest of us. It was very much about the feds are trying to tell us what to do. That argument, which has shaped us in every ensuing decade, it has some origins way, way back. Jefferson versus Hamilton was to some extent about this in the early republic. But for our purposes, for the modern world, the reaction after the Civil War of the white Southerners trying to say, federal troops need to get out of here, we don't want Reconstruction forces, we want to govern our own affairs, all goes back to this idea that the war was lost, but we could win the peace. The Lost Cause as an idea in the book itself caught fire and endured because it spoke to this deep longing on the part of a defeated people to both find meaning in the defeat and a way forward, but not a way forward in acquiescence to federal will, but a way forward in resistance to that will. There were many white Southerners who tried to argue that they were fighting for states' rights and not slavery. It's not an argument that holds up by any means, but the postbellum vision of a lost cause gave them a way forward, a way to think of the struggle in not just in racial terms, but as a whole political identity. The lost cause sanctifies the Southern vision of the world. It becomes a cause that was not defeated morally, but was defeated because they were outmanned, they were outgunned. But it let them say, you know what, we were right. In our essence, we were right. And white supremacy is a principle worth defending. I mean, the lost cause gave a defeated people both an explanation for why they'd lost. The industrial North in all its might had defeated us, but we were right. We were right. And they're hypocrites because they're racist too. And it enabled a bunch of white Southerners to justify their racism from decade to decade to decade. Confederate memorials come a bit later. There was no money to build Confederate monuments. Most of the monuments put up in the South in the wake of the war were Union monuments because they had won and they had money. The true end of Reconstruction, formally in the 1890s, tended to lead to a burst in the monuments. It's a fascinating story about how Confederate memory was formed. The war became more Virginia-centric than Tennessee or Alabama or Mississippi. General Lee became the saint. There was an attempt to make Lee the martyr, and Lee was an appealing figure for that role. General Lee became the sainted martyr who, if only he'd had the strength, the guns, the men and material that Grant had had, he would have carried the day. And by being a martyr, it suggested that Lee was right, but was unjustly defeated. And that meant that white Southerners who believed in the antebellum vision of racism, of a race-based world, were also right. The political and cultural salience of the white supremacy argument was that anyone who was white, rich or middling or poor, could unite against the blacks. And so as a political strategy, it enabled people of means to enlist those who might have different economic interests than people with means against a common enemy. The religious angle of the lost cause created an energy, a common vernacular in a fairly church-going region. A key element of the Christian story is that in defeat there is victory. There is no crown without the cross. There's no Easter without Good Friday. And so what Pollard and others were doing was saying, as a region, we're a little bit like Jesus. We had to suffer, but a day will come when the tomb will open and we will rise again. The South will rise again is intrinsically a religious cry because Jesus rose again. And anyone hearing that phrase in the American South, either consciously or subconsciously, would have associated their own fate with that of the God they purported to follow. You have to use what you've got, right? And the only thing the white Southerners had to build a resistance was sentimentality and religion. And, well, three things. White Southerners had three things to make the lost cause work. They had sentimentality, they had religion, and they had racism. And it made a potent cocktail when you put the three together. If you're going to fight the lost cause, you have to fight on the field where they are. And the idea that a Christian society, a society that purports to be Christian, would enslave others and discriminate against others in a systemic way has to be combated, at least in part, with the same language and the same arsenal with which the cause was laid out. And so lost cause folks want the South to have been Jesus on Good Friday, but Easter is coming. Seems to me, if you want to argue that the vision of Gettysburg, the new birth of freedom, the vision of Lincoln's second inaugural with malice toward none, with charity for all, you have to speak in biblical terms as well, which is what Lincoln did. You have to speak in terms of do unto others. You have to speak in terms of the key element of the faith that in many ways was perverted to try to secure and perpetuate a form of enslavement. The language to fight that is the language of liberation. Well, what is the duty of a Christian? The duty of a Christian is to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It's, in the words of the Great Commandment, to love God totally and to love others as you would want to be loved. And so in any public policy question, that's applicable. Healthcare, taxation, anything about the infrastructure of a democratic life can be about how would I want to be treated, and therefore I should treat others that way. And that's in many ways, even taking the religious element out of it, is the fundamental covenant of a democratic republic, lowercase d, lowercase r. If we don't have a sense of neighborliness, if I don't at least somewhat care about what folks in California are doing or people in New York and I'm in Tennessee, why should I pay taxes for them to benefit? And why should they pay taxes for me to benefit? Except that we're part of a covenant that runs on empathy, runs on mutual concessions of opinion, which is a phrase of Jefferson's, and really comes to be and endures because ultimately I care what happens to you in the hopes that you're going to, at some point, when I'm in trouble, care about what happens to me. Without that covenant, free government falls apart. If you know that this is not the first time we've dealt with these issues, then you are able to revisit those moments and see how they got out of them. So how did we get out of the long shadow of Reconstruction? We barely have, and there are still, look at Charlottesville, there are still moments where it's very much with us. But we got out of it in a serious way in the middle of the 1960s because Lyndon Johnson, speaking in the language of faith, said that God should favor our undertaking, that we should, in fact, extend our arms. We should not clench our fists. We get out of these moments by more generously applying what Jefferson meant when he wrote that all men were created equal. And that can sound gooey, and it can sound lefty, I guess, in this climate, but it has the virtue of being true. There's not a moment. Think about a moment you would want to go back to in American life. And I promise you that that moment would be one in which reformers and others were trying desperately to widen the mainstream and not close it. If you drive through Washington, walk through Washington, the monuments are to people who are about opening things, not closing them. Monument to George Washington, monument to Abraham Lincoln, monument to Thomas Jefferson, monument to the Second World War. Those folks, Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, were not perfect. Not arguing that. No one is. But if those flawed people could leave us something that was worth defending and something on which we could build, if they could do it, then don't we have an intellectual and moral obligation, that sounds grand, but an obligation to look and see how they did it. So it's the winter of 1866-67, down in Giles County, Tennessee, in a law office near the courthouse. And a group of old Confederates gets together, and they decide to form what would be called the Ku Klux Klan. And the Klan was going to be the Knights of the Invisible Empire. And the Invisible Empire was the ghosts, the spirit of the Confederacy that may have been defeated at Appomattox but would rise again and would now fight and would punish people who were cooperating with Reconstruction Authority, would terrorize African Americans, would really continue the battles of the Civil War in an era when those battles were supposed to be over. It's very hard to put ourselves back in a pre-civil rights mindset, but to understand history, we have to. It was perfectly respectable for white Southerners in the 1860s and 70s into the 1950s and 1960s to believe that white people were innately superior. The Confederacy had been founded on this idea. The vice president of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, gave a speech saying that the cornerstone of the Confederacy was the fact that blacks were inherently inferior. And to these people, the Civil War had not changed that. And they were going to carry on this battle by other means. So the Ku Klux Klan became a paramilitary force to continue to fight for the cause of white supremacy when we were supposed to have settled that. And so when people say the Civil War never really ended, that's pretty much what they mean. The Klan was ferociously violent. U.S. Grant, when he becomes president, does a pretty good job of shutting it down. The Justice Department comes into being largely to fight the Klan. Grant actually wrote out in his own hand the enforcement act he needed, the powers he needed to break it. But the fact that it had to be done suggests the strength, the depth, the durability of the underlying feelings of a Confederacy that was defeated but was not going quietly into the night. Grant, as president, decided that he would in fact break the back of the Klan. that this was an unacceptable paramilitary force in the country. And in one of the few bright moments of Reconstruction, one of the few bright moments in race relations from the war through the Civil Rights era, he did what he could to use law enforcement, use the military to shut down this marauding vigilante force. Grant goes to Congress, writes down on a piece of paper in his own hand the powers he needs to exert federal authority into the states in order to break the Klan. Using his officials, it was the first time, we would see it again in the 1950s and 1960s, where Washington was deputizing officials to go and fight in the states that otherwise saw themselves as sovereign. The lesson to learn is that the federal government, when it puts its mind to something, can create great change. It creates great backlash as well. But without the federal government, I'm not sure how my native region stumbles into modernity at all. And we think of this as in terms of the Civil Rights era. We think of it in terms of President Kennedy and President Johnson enforcing the court orders, the Supreme Court orders in the middle of the 20th century. But their precedent, their case study, was the way Grant reacted to the Klan. No southern state escaped this. Florida, Texas, Virginia, there is no part of the old Confederacy that escaped what I would call the shame of racially reactive postbellum violence. On the Saturday after Thanksgiving in 1915, on Stone Mountain, Georgia, near Atlanta, the Ku Klux Klan is refounded. And it's refounded in reaction to a couple of things. Shifting economy from an agrarian to an industrial world. 1920 would be the first time we would record that more urban folks were living in urban areas than in rural areas. Immigration was at an extraordinary high. 1890s was the peak. But people were coming in. There was white anxiety about cultural identity, about economic opportunity, about a shifting culture. Radio becomes a big force in the early 1920s. The second Klan is really about how do we protect this American way of life. 1917 is the Bolshevik Revolution. You have World War I coming with incredible anxiety about socialists and anarchists and dissidents, and the country felt as if it were spinning out of control. And so the second Klan, which ultimately attracted, we think, between 2 and 6 million Americans, it took the 1924 Democratic National Convention to 103 ballots because there were 347 Klan delegates at Madison Square Garden who would not vote for Al Smith, the governor of New York, because Al Smith was an Irish Catholic. The governors of Texas, Georgia, Colorado, Indiana, and Oregon were all members of the Klan. Hugo Black, future Supreme Court Justice, was a member of the Klan. Harry Truman almost joined, but he had a lot of Catholic friends, and so that kept him from doing it. It was a big, broad-based, reactionary movement about what that was seen as foreign and sinister influence in the United States. And what they wanted to do was make America great again. And what they wanted to do was try to create really a paramilitary army that was both literal and figurative to defend this idea of what was called 100% Americanism. Americanism was a predominant phrase because there was a genuine anxiety that the Bolsheviks were coming here. So President Wilson closes down 400 newspapers. A. Mitchell Palmer, the Attorney General under Wilson, launches a number of raids on suspected dissidents. An anarchist tried to blow up the Attorney General's house. He lived across the street from FDR, who was then the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. The Roosevelts were finding body parts in their bushes. It was an era where people in power were cracking down on civil dissent. They were fighting immigration. They were fighting the movement towards civil rights. The NAACP had been founded in 1909, coming out of what was called the Niagara Movement, 1905. And so the country seemed to be changing. Immigrants, people of color, national culture, different ways of making a living. The familiar world of the farm where you controlled your whole life. You decided where you went to church. You decided what newspapers to subscribe to. You decided what books to read. You totally controlled your family until about 1920, 21, 22. And the Klan stepped in, exploited and exacerbated those tensions to the point where in 1925 and 26, 50,000 Klansmen marched down Pennsylvania Avenue in what was a remarkable but not stunning public display. The Klan of the 19-teens and 20s was focused on immigration, disappearing jobs, a changing culture, and playing to a sentimental understanding of a country that had been lost but might be able to be recovered with the right set of political action, the right journey backward. It's incredibly resonant, the story of the Second Klan. I'd argue that actually that's probably, that 10-year period, 1915 to about 1925, is probably the most analogous period because you had a significant social movement focused on the other. You were feeling your world slipping away. Either you had been on a farm, you were moving to a city, and suddenly the city you moved to for a job, that job was being taken by an immigrant, perhaps. You reacted by either joining or supporting the work of an organization that was devoted to this mythic, racially charged vision of a country that had been taken away, but you had to try to take it back. And that was really the work of the Second Klan. Membership in the Klan was a group, a family, an organization, a sense of purpose, a vision, a idea that you belonged and were fighting a noble cause. And there are few things more seductive to human nature than the sense that you are fighting a noble cause. And if that noble cause happens to run parallel with your self-interest, all the better. So D.W. Griffiths makes the movie, the big blockbuster of the era, Birth of a Nation. It presented this hopelessly antiquated white supremacist version of Reconstruction. It cast African Americans as evil and the other, and gave this idea of knights of the invisible empire. You could become a knight. Imagine this. You're a white guy, you have lived on a farm, probably grew up on a farm, you moved to a city, the job's not working out, the job might disappear because of somebody who doesn't look like you, maybe a Roman Catholic, maybe Southern European, whatever it is. And suddenly someone comes along and says, we're going to make you a knight of the invisible empire, and you are going to fight for your racial identity and fight for your job, and we are going to take our country back from these interlopers. It's an incredibly seductive and attractive vision for people who are discontented and seeking some means of control in a world that feels as though it's slipped out of their hands. Most presidents, after they leave office, begin to look better. Woodrow Wilson is that rare example of a president who looks worse the more time passes. He resegregated the federal government. He cracked down on civil dissent and civil liberties during the war. He screened Birth of a Nation at the White House. The movie makers, like all great movie makers, used anything they could for promotion, so they gave this sense that he had endorsed it. There's some debate about that, but he did screen it. You know, Wilson was very much a creature of his time. He was a figure of the progressive era, but it was a white supremacist progressive era. And I don't think we do any justice to him to sugarcoat that. One of the great things about America is that every action creates a reaction. So during World War I, when Wilson cracks down on civil liberties, you get the ACLU, you get the American Civil Liberties Union to fight for civil liberties. After Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, and with the rising number of lynchings around the South, the continuance of the black codes of segregation, you got W.E.B. Du Bois, and you got the NAACP, a group devoted to trying to make what had been the hope at the end of the Civil War a reality. Du Bois writes about fear quite brilliantly. He talks about the capacity of a mob, by which he means a white mob, to do things together that they would never do individually. That there was a multiplier effect of fear and anxiety and hate. And that back of the writhing mob, there was this fear, this anxiety that tomorrow was not going to be what it could be for you, and it was not going to be what yesterday was. And fear is such an important element of the American story, and it's this perennial struggle between hope and fear. Edmund Burke said, there's nothing so unreasoning as fear. You know, if you're on the edge of a precipice, you're not going to act rationally. You're going to try to get back from it. And so often, people in American history have felt that they were on a precipice. And so they lash out, they flail. You saw it with white Southerners after Reconstruction. You saw it with the Second Klan and the immigration, the shifting economy. You saw it in the 1930s. You saw it in the 1950s and 1960s with white Southerners worried about integration. You see it now. Industrial economies giving way to an information economy. There are people who do not believe that tomorrow is going to be better than today. And sure as hell ain't going to be better than yesterday was, at least in their minds. And so you lash out. You struggle for something. You point. And it's their fault. It's those Mexicans. It's those Chinese. It's those Italians. It's those Irish. It's those blacks. It's those women. It's those Jews. It's an incredibly powerful political emotion. And the great political leaders are the ones who don't cater to it, who tamp it down instead of flame it. It's 1924. Warren Harding has died. Calvin Coolidge has become president on the Republican side. The Democrats meet at Madison Square Garden to nominate someone to take on President Coolidge. There are about 347 Klan delegates there. It drives the convention to 103 ballots, most ballots in history, because the Klan would not support Al Smith, the governor of New York, known as the Happy Warrior, because Al Smith was an Irish Catholic. And Irish Catholics were seen as this foreign force, a sinister force. Roman Catholicism was a particularly favorite target of the Second Klan. Out in Oregon, a Klan-dominated legislature had passed a law saying that every school-aged child had to go to a public school in an attempt to shut down the parochial schools. They were basically trying to put the nuns out of business. So in 1924, in New York, the convention went on and on and on. Eventually, Smith was defeated. John W. Davis, not a name that lives in the annals of history, becomes the Democratic nominee because of anti-Catholic sentiment. Nativism, like isolationism, like racism, is a perennial force. It ebbs and it flows. It was flowing in American life, particularly after the 1890s or so. You had a lot of immigration coming in. It didn't really stop until the 1924 immigration legislation, which put quotas on national immigration from different countries. Nativists are people who only trust those, by definition, who are born in a particular country. And so American nativists in the first part of the 20th century believed that American-born Americans were the only true Americans. And anyone who had immigrated here was somehow suspect. The Red Scare in 1919-1920 was about and fear of immigrants, and fear basically because of the Bolshevik Revolution, which brought the communists to power, and the disorienting impact of the First World War. It led to another ism worth avoiding, which is isolationism. You had a prevalent fear that radicals, socialists, communists, Bolsheviks were taking the country away. That's the perennial theme here, is that somehow or another some group has gotten over the city wall, is in our midst, and is trying to take everything away from us. The First World War creates all kinds of isms that are worth avoiding. There's nativism, there's isolationism. There was in the Red Scare an anxiety that communists were coming to get us, that Russia had fallen to the Bolsheviks, the royal family was murdered. This was a live fear in the country that a revolution that had started far away would come here. And part of the appeal of the Klan, part of the appeal of a growing isolationist movement, a growing nativist movement, was if we were not 100% Americans, if we were not 100% practicing 100% Americanism, then somehow or another we would lose what we cherished most. And when the argument is you are going to lose what you love, few more powerful political arguments than that. People saying you're going to lose what you love and it's their fault. And I'm pointing right at the people, and those are the people we need to take on. And whether they're Catholics or Jews or immigrants or whatever they are, the force of the other, of demonizing the other, has been one of our most perennial and least attractive and least productive cultural forces. In times of fear, people turn on the press as well. They don't want to read, they don't want to hear, they don't want to see disturbing messages. And if they believe that the press is somehow exacerbating the threat to the country, then they try to take out the messenger. Woodrow Wilson enforced the Sedition Act. His Postmaster General closed down 400 newspapers and magazines that were deemed radical or un-American. Usually that meant they were pacifists. Usually that meant they just disagreed with them. And it takes a strong country, a strong leader, to understand that, as Jefferson said, if the choice is between having a government with no newspapers or newspapers with no government, I'll take newspapers with no government. Because without a free press, without free expression, without the ability to be wrong, without the ability to listen to someone with whom you wildly disagree, but always defend their right to say that with which you disagree, without that, it's not a democracy, it's an autocracy. And if you want an autocracy, you better be sure that your guy is the autocrat. Because today's autocrat is tomorrow's deposed autocrat. And it's one of the reasons religious toleration is so important. You know, if you want a state religion, you better be sure that your state, if you're in it, you better be sure it holds power, because tomorrow you may not be the one. In my view, there are about 5 elements that can help shape an era for good or for ill. There's the presidency, the Congress, the courts, the press, and the people themselves. And my view is if 2 or 3 of those are rowing in the right direction, we have a good chance. In the rise of the Second Klan, the presidency was not too bad. Harding and Coolidge both spoke out against it, if in guarded terms. The courts were strong. Supreme Court ruled against it in a couple of key cases. The press did a good job. Joseph Pulitzer's newspapers, others did a lot of exposés, although that sometimes cuts the other way. The Klan leadership in the 20s thought that having congressional hearings against the Klan had increased their numbers, because they could say, see, they know how powerful we are. They're coming after us. If we must be doing something right if the people in power are against us. And that's one of the dangerous and seductive, to some extent, dynamics of populism, is if you hold to a conspiratorial worldview, then you put yourself in a kind of tragic position that any counter-argument, any argument that might challenge that conspiratorial worldview is seen not as a potentially prevailing argument, but as confirmation that you were right in the first place. See, they're after us. And that's a loop, a self-reinforcing loop, that our greatest moments have been marked by moments in which we have broken out of that. There's no thing new under the sun, and the Scopes trial in Dayton in 1925 was an early culture war, what we would think of now. You can imagine how cable news would cover this. You know, if O.J. were a science versus faith issue. The trial was an emblem of this anxiety about modernity. You had people who didn't want to think. They were descended from apes and believed that if the Bible could simply be true, then it would both invest them with a certain dignity and would put the people who seemed to be changing their world in their place. And so it was a media circus, broadcast on the radio. It was the wall-to-wall coverage of the era. And in many ways, I think it's an example of how people who feel a great deal of stress lash out. And these were people who felt stress economically, socially, culturally, and they wanted their Bible to be the first and last word. And they didn't want to hear about science. They weren't interested in that because the one thing they had was Genesis. This is the way it was written. This is the way it was. And if you're going to come in with these newfangled theories and throw everything up in the air, and I can't even count on my Bible, then what on earth can I count on? The Klan faded, not least because enough people stood up and said, we're not going to be superstitious. We're not going to be as racially divided as the Klan wants us to be. And the fact of the matter is that we were created equal and that we should not be separating into these paramilitary armies doing battle against each other. I think the fall of the Klan in many ways is a victory of reason. It is a victory of people listening to their better angels, realizing that people who simply were from a different country are not innately inferior. That's not a reasonable thing to think. And it was really, in many ways, the triumph of the mind over the gut. One of the great miracles of American history is that the Klan dissipated before the crisis of the 1930s came. It came about because of internal Klan dissensions. We were very lucky because it was hard enough for Franklin Roosevelt to do what he did in the early 1930s. One would have thought that given the cataclysm of the crash in 29 leading to the Depression in 32 and 33, that the Klan would have sputtered back to life, but it didn't. And we were incredibly lucky in that sense because it was hard enough for FDR to do what he had to do. He had Wall Street bankers who were plotting against him, trying to bribe the American Legion to come and form a fascist army that would throw Roosevelt out of office. You know, the line that got the biggest cheer on FDR's inauguration day was that we are now at a point where he may have to govern as if we had been invaded by a foreign foe. And the crowd roared. And Mrs. Roosevelt wrote that it chilled her to the bone, that the crowd seemed ready for a dictator. The line we remember in sentiment is the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. That day, the more intriguing line, the more resonant line, was one about a strong man. And so the crisis of the 30s would have been immeasurably worse, I think, if the Klan had endured at strength. The Klan fell because both Harding and Coolidge didn't give it oxygen. There were internal dissensions the Klan itself was corrupt. And there were enough people who had joined this to be a night of purity that they realized that if the organization itself was impure, it was not worth their money and their time. And I think the courts did a good job. The courts ruled that you had to publish the names of the members, so suddenly what seemed to be a great idea when you weren't in the paper wasn't such a great idea when you were in the paper. That's a pretty good test. If you're not willing to stand up and be counted for what you're doing, then more likely than not, you shouldn't do it. And I think that, to some extent, was part of the Klan's fall. Harding and Coolidge both decided that they would issue general but pointed statements about fraternal orders that seemed to be conspiring against a great American center. This is not to make anyone a hero out of this. This was an era where political equality was still very much an ideal. People thought about political equality, but they weren't really thinking as much about social equality. So even at the most progressive, a lot of people within the mainstream were about protecting civil rights, but were not about creating a pluralistic, multi-ethnic, integrated society as we know. One of the things to keep in mind is that that pluralistic, multi-ethnic, integrated society is a very recent idea, and even a more recent reality. Coolidge, in particular, wrote a letter that was quite well known, attacking someone who had attacked him for an African American being a Republican nominee for Congress. And Coolidge said, "This is democracy. This is the way the system is supposed to work." So without lionizing the past, we, I think, do have to give due credit to those who, in the context of their times, took strides forward. Harding faced charges that he had descended from mixed race ancestry, which was an attempt to smear him in the context of the time. Personal attacks, racially explicit attacks, are a perennial force in American politics. It didn't just start with the 2016 election. And we recur to it again and again, not least because it tends to work. And enough people, hopefully on the margins, but enough people react to them that it becomes politically salient for those who have that ammunition to use it. And the only way to fight that is not to let it work. The critique of my argument, basically, is here's a white Southern man saying everything's going to be all right. Maybe in part because my life experience would suggest that everything would be all right. Fair enough, fine. I don't think that's particularly helpful because if we don't look back, we're not going to see what any of the analogies are, what any of the precedents were. But when we look back, we also have to give credit to a basic story of American progress. It may be slower than a lot of us would like. It may be more tragic. It may be bloodier. It may be incomplete. It's all those things. But it's the fact of the matter is that we have moved from a place where we would not want to be to a place that we prefer. Now, is a place of preference a place of perfection? Absolutely not. But why would you foreclose the possibility of looking back and drawing some inspiration for the journey that we have taken? Why would you let the perfect be the enemy of the good? I don't see the point of that. One can argue that to some extent women's suffrage began with Abigail Adams, who in March of 1776 wrote a letter to John Adams, who was down in Philadelphia for the Continental Congress, saying, "Remember the ladies, because you all are always so, your sex is too tyrannical," which we've also proven to be the case. There was a ferocious fight through the 19th century. Seneca Falls in 1848 was a moment where suffrage leaders issued the statement that all men and women are created equal. To some extent, the battle for suffrage was sidetracked by the emphasis on African-American male suffrage. There was always tension there. The movement for women's suffrage, interestingly, has sort of slipped into the mists. We know about the Civil War. We know about the fire hoses and Jim Crow. We don't know much about the 19th Amendment. There were force feedings in prison. There were hunger strikes. There were women who courageously were arrested in acts of civil disobedience outside the White House. There were women who dropped a banner during one of Wilson's State of the Union addresses saying, "What about the women, Mr. Wilson?" They were willing to risk everything. They learned a lot of this from their comrades in England, from that battle. And there was violence at suffrage marches in Washington, men scorning this effort. Because guess what? If you're the white man susceptible to the appeal of the Klan in the second decade of the 20th century, my God, now the women want to vote. Immigrants are taking my job. Catholics are trying to change my culture. And now women want to vote. What's next? That was the view. It all sounds kind of crazy when you list it that way, but part of history is putting yourself back in the shoes of those in real time, and that's what a lot of those guys thought. Into the 20th century, you had Alice Paul, who launched a very direct campaign focused on the White House, trying to get Woodrow Wilson to endorse the suffrage movement. Alice Paul was born in New Jersey. She went to England to learn suffrage methods, try to figure out how women in England had won the right to vote, came back and launched a very focused campaign on Woodrow Wilson himself. Took up residence on Lafayette Square, right across from the White House, made a point of having people at every gate of the White House so that the president would have to see them when he came and he went. She was determined to take the fight directly to him and ultimately won. And she was a key factor in Wilson ultimately endorsing the amendment, which finally extended the suffrage, as Abigail Adams would have wanted, I think. For those who think that the country can't change, I sometimes submit that 100 years ago, more than half the population couldn't vote. Now, again, it took too long, but things can get better. And one of the key things about the country is that, not that suddenly presidents like Fortinbras appear and put everything in order. Change comes when the powerful listen to the powerless. There's never been a significant leap forward in American life that has not come from the many and as opposed to the few. Abolition, suffrage, civil rights. Lyndon Johnson, Woodrow Wilson, Abraham Lincoln were not singular actors who waved a historical magic wand and made things better because they wanted to. They were able to marshal the energy of an enormous number of people, innumerable people, who sacrificed everything trying to get us to listen to those better angels. Change comes in this country when the powerful pay attention to the powerless. And if you can tell the story to the powerful, that we will remember them fondly, they will go down in history as great people. If they do that, then that's one of the reasons to tell this story. It's not to romanticize the past. It's not to glorify a handful of white male leaders. But as long as leaders are going to be in positions where they can effect serious change, why not give credit to those who did that in the past, if only to encourage those who have the option now of deciding whether to do it or not. Do you want to be FDR or do you want to be Andrew Johnson? Do you want to be Lyndon Johnson or do you want to be James Buchanan? Most presidents I know would answer that they want to be FDR, they want to be Lyndon Johnson. They don't want to be Johnson, they don't want to be Buchanan. And if we don't tell that story in those terms, then we lose that arrow in our quiver. Woodrow Wilson should have seen this coming. When he arrived in Washington in 1913 for his inauguration, there was a paucity of a receiving crowd, and he actually asked, "Where are all the people?" And all the people were at a suffrage march elsewhere in Washington. A key example of the people without power doing the work of citizenship while the powerful were lagging behind. On the one hand, 100 years after the 19th Amendment, totally understandable why people would say that change has come far too slowly. But we are trying to do something here that nobody else has tried to do, which is run a pluralistic, multi-ethnic, democratic republic over a vast expanse of territory. And it seems to me that the change is going to get more rapid. That is, that once it starts, it's going to be total. And it wouldn't surprise me at all to see that one of the results of the shifting sense of identity and what I suspect will be a reaction to the more exclusionary culture of the post-2016 election would be, if not the election of a female president, certainly a very a great openness to it. It's also worth noting Secretary Clinton won the popular vote. I would feel very differently about all of this if the incumbent president had won the popular vote. He's president because of a quirk of an 18th century constitutional system. More people wanted her to be in charge of their destinies than wanted him to be. And that, however unsatisfying, is progress. We never know when the movement gains momentum or not. It took 100 years for Jim Crow to fall apart. It took a long time for women's suffrage to pass. Without the steady acts of citizenship and protest, with no particular expectation that there'll be a high return on your investment anytime soon, the story of the country would be radically different. And you wish there were a three-point plan. You wish there were a PowerPoint that you could say, here's how to change the world. But there's really not. It's a long, complicated story. And often it's hard to know exactly when or what will fully attract the attention and ultimately the power of those who hold office. 1965, Lyndon Johnson is surprised by Bloody Sunday. John Lewis is nearly beaten to death. Hosea Williams almost beaten to death on the streets of Selma, Alabama. The images from the march go. Frank Reynolds is angering ABC News. He interrupts the broadcast premiere of Judgment at Nuremberg to show this scene of a posse of Alabama officials attacking peaceful, nonviolent marchers. 8 days later, Johnson goes to Congress and says, there are times when history and fate intersect to shape a turning point in man's unending search for freedom. So it was at Lexington and Concord, so it was at Appomattox, so it was last week in Selma, Alabama. Why Lexington and Concord and not someplace else? Why Appomattox and not someplace else? Why Selma and not someplace else? Because in the mystery of history, there is this moment where the endless ripples that gather strength far from the centers of power finally wash over those centers. We certainly have agency in creating history. We just don't know when or how. We may know why. That's good. But think of it this. What if Franklin Roosevelt had been killed in December of 1932 in Miami? An assassin tried to kill him, killed the mayor of Chicago who was sitting next to him. Would the 1930s and the 1940s have turned out the way they did without Franklin Roosevelt? I'm not sure they would have. The story of Reconstruction might be radically different if Lincoln had not been killed. What if Lyndon Johnson had decided to take a pass on voting rights in the spring of 1965. I know it might be frustrating, but history's not science. History's the story of all of us. And I think we all know, when we're being honest with ourselves, that we're incredibly complicated. And there are moments when I very much want to do the right thing, but for a number of reasons I won't do it. And there's some moments I don't want to do the right thing at all, and certainly don't do it. The country's the same way. There have been three great inflection points in terms of a broad identity politics in the American context: abolition, emancipation, suffrage, and then the end of Jim Crow. And a common lesson there is that the leadership classes lagged behind the activist classes. The activists were right longer than the leadership was. And what I would hope is that by telling that story, we would prompt people to say, what are the activists telling us that we're not either listening closely enough to or not reacting to? Because if the voices of abolition were right early, and they were, and the voices for suffrage were right early, and they were, and the voices against Jim Crow were right early, and they were, what are the voices now that are right and early and we're not paying attention to? It's Christmas Eve, 1929. The stock market has crashed in October. The prosperity of the 20s has popped, basically. And God doesn't give you many metaphors like this, but Herbert Hoover is in the main part of the White House having dinner in black tie when the Oval Office goes up in flames. The West Wing is on fire. Uncontrollable, elemental. Hoover can't fix it. That's all you need to tell the story of the late 20s and early 30s. The country is in the throes of what becomes a global depression. We're paying the price for isolationism, paying the price for closing ourselves off after 1924 in many ways, by instituting immigration quotas, by putting up high tariffs, by basically retreating to a kind of fortress America. We'd gone over, we'd fought the First World War, we didn't feel it had done what we wanted to do, we'd rejected the League of Nations, the idea that we would be engaged. We had this vision that somehow or another our oceans would protect us from history, would protect us from the rest of the world, and yet we were part of a global economy even then. By the spring of 1933, 1 out of every 4 adult American men was out of work. There were riots in the Midwest. There was a live question about whether democratic capitalism could survive the decade. As Churchill put it, as only Churchill could do, America was trying to burn brightly against the baleful flames of Soviet Bolshevism and the lurid flames of Nordic self-assertion from Berlin. Churchill could say anything well. Read the phone book, he'd be great. There was this real question. Could self-government in a capitalistic society work? A lot of people didn't think so. And onto that stage comes Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had been one of the brightest young politicians in the Democratic Party in 1920, run for vice president, has the most famous political name in America, goes to a Boy Scout camp on his way to Campobello off the coast of Maine, wakes up a few mornings later and can't walk, wills himself back into the arena, fights infantile paralysis, and becomes, in a way, the embodiment of the American notion that we can recover. And he believed we could all walk again, not least because he had taught himself to walk again. And that sounds homiletic, and it sounds sentimental perhaps, but it's true. He did. FDR is alleged to have said that the two redeeming features of American life is that we have a sense of hope and a sense of humor. And he played to both of those. and argued fundamentally that our instinct for hope had to overcome our susceptibility to fear. And that was his singular contribution in many ways. We all know this. The only way to understand the market is to realize that it's not understandable. It's not a comprehensible thing because it's all based on emotion, and most of it. And the banks were closing, and basically what makes things run is faith. Faith that the dollar will be worth something, faith that if you pay this bill, it works out, whatever it might be. And he did everything he could in that bleak winter to 1933 to restore that faith. Douglas MacArthur had attacked the bonus army, World War I marchers who'd come to Washington looking for their pension. MacArthur had launched the army at him. When FDR became president, he sent Mrs. Roosevelt out to see them, and one of them remarked, Hoover sent MacArthur and Roosevelt sent his wife. And that sort of told you the distinction between the two. Oliver Wendell Holmes had said of FDR that he had a second-rate intellect but a first-class temperament. And temperament meant a lot in democratic leadership. There's something about the tone and the tenor of the person at the center of things. Roosevelt himself understood the office that way. He wrote in a little piece that was published on September 11th, 1932, in the New York Times, that the presidency is not an engineering or administrative office. It is preeminently a place of moral leadership, by which he meant temperamental leadership. If he could be buoyant, then we would be buoyant. History tends to render a different judgment often than the present does. And FDR was seen as, I think as Walter Lippmann put it, he's a very talented young man who simply seems to want to be president very much, and was not seen as the savior of the republic, trust me. But there was something about, I think, his particular biographical experience that was essential in that moment, and his willingness to, as he put it, practice a bold, persistent spirit of experimentation. Bold, persistent spirit of experimentation. Try a method, and if it fails, admit it frankly, but above all, try something. And we went through almost 3 or 4 iterations of the New Deal. Agencies would be created, they'd fall apart, they would, it would on and on. But he spent that decade trying to save capitalism from the capitalists, redefine the relationship of the individual and the state. You can argue whether that was a good or a bad thing, but the American way was in the dock on March 4th, 1933, in a way it was not in the dock on April 12th, 1945, which is the day he died in Warm Springs. And he's not alone in making that happen. He gave voice to countless others. People wanted that from him. And in that mysterious connection between chieftain and follower, you had the story of rescuing America from one abyss and then helping rescue the rest of the world from a different and even more deadly abyss. My friend David McCullough likes to say, no one walked around in the past and said, my, what an interesting world the past is. It's all conditional. It's all contingent. Would a different president have done what FDR did? It's unknowable, unlikely. There was a particular set of circumstances, a particular set of skills he brought to that. Are we less resilient than Americans were in 1933? Maybe not less resilient. We know each other less. We're unified by less. The cataclysm of the Depression itself created bonds of shared experience that helped us when the crisis of the Second World War came. So that's different. But at every point when we've been challenged, the present generation has wondered whether they could rise to it. Whether it was the founding generation, the War of 1812, the Age of Jackson, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, the Depression, the Cold War, the crises of the 60s. And at every point, we have in fact risen to that occasion and continued to create a more perfect union. Does that mean the story continues to unfold that way? No, doesn't necessarily mean that way. There's no happily ever after, there's no once upon a time. But there has been St. Augustine. You haven't had St. Augustine thrown at you yet. St. Augustine once defined a nation as a multitude of rational beings united by the common objects of their love. Multitude of rational beings united by the common objects of their love. So one of the things we always have to ask is, what do we love in common? In the 1930s, we loved the experiment enough, the capitalistic democratic experiment enough, that we were going to defend it. The Cold War, we loved liberty enough that we were going to defend that. So the question now is, what do we love in common? Do we love these institutions enough? Do we love a Constitution that makes rapid change for the good very difficult, but it also makes rapid change for the ill very difficult? Do we have enough of that in common? My own bet is yes, but it's just that. It's just a bet. No one ever became president because of a vanishingly small ego. That just doesn't happen. People who put themselves in the way of high politics are people who believe that they have something to contribute that other people do not. And that requires a pretty strong ego. George W. Bush is very funny about this. He says, it takes a lot of ego to say, hey, what about me, of 300 million people? And he's right. It does. And so I think the remarkable thing about American presidents is they aren't crazier, actually. I mean, most of them are pretty well adjusted. There are exceptions. There are really at least two kinds of populism. Populism being the sense that the virtues of the many are being stymied or taken over by the interests of the few. And so a populist leader is one who appeals to the masses, saying, this group or that individual, they're trying to block you from your greatness, or they're trying to take away what is rightfully yours. So you are a populist if you appeal to the masses against elites of some kind or the other of some kind. There's economic populism, which is we want to make sure there's enough wealth for everybody. And there's cultural populism, which is a leader who says to the masses, this small elite is not letting you be all you want to be, or wants you to think like them. They want to tell you what to think. In the 1930s, you had all kinds. You had both kinds. You had Huey Long, who was an economic populist who he was sort of the Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, if they had a Louisiana accent, very much wanted to share the wealth, wanted to create more of a wealth equality across the board. Father Coughlin, Charles Coughlin, the radio priest, and others were more about the Jews, the bankers. They're trying to take away what's yours. And what they have in common, what populists tend to have in common, is that they want you to blame someone else. And it's a politics that is less about positive motion forward and more about pointing fingers. It's not always true, but that's largely true. Charismatic leadership is essential to populism because by its very nature, populism is about inspiring an enormous number of people to rise up against a smaller number of people. And so if you are charismatic, which means touched by the gods, if you are someone who can rile up a crowd, you're more likely to be an effective populist. The 1930s were a decade where people were anxious. They were hungry for leaders who would give them a story to explain not only why they felt the way they felt, but a way to get them out of it. And the populism of the 30s was about wealth inequality, identity groups, the out-of-touch nature of alleged elites at a time of isolationism, at a time when people didn't want to be engaged with the world because they thought somehow or another they'd gotten a raw deal under Woodrow Wilson during the First World War. They hadn't gotten what they were supposed to get for projecting that force. And so in many ways, the 30s were a backlash to the more global vision of Wilson in 17 and 18. I don't think there's any doubt that the isolationism of our own time is a reaction to the forward-leaning nature of both the Cold War leadership and George W. Bush's forward-leaning leadership after the attacks of September 11th. When we think of FDR, we think of the great line, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," which is a marvelous sentiment. The line that got the biggest cheer that day, though, was when she said that the current crisis is of such scope that he might require powers as if we had been invaded by a foreign foe. And the crowd roared. And it suggested to Eleanor Roosevelt, who wrote that she was chilled by it, that they were ready for a dictator, that the world had become so seemingly complicated, so seemingly out of control, that this 18th century constitutional system of checks and balances was not commensurate with the challenges of global governance in a rapidly shrinking world. Sounds pretty familiar. And her concern, and the concern of a lot of folks, because dictatorship was on the march. Look at Germany, look at Italy, look at the increasing totalitarianization of the Soviet Union. The anxiety was that amid the crisis of the Depression, popular dictatorial leaders would present themselves as heroic figures who could restore prosperity, restore national greatness, and therefore the pesky yet wonderfully essential elements of democracy would go by the wayside. That was the fear. Like everything else, totalitarianism, dictatorships ebb and flow. It's flowing right now. You know, 100 years ago or more, we were moving from an agrarian to an industrial economy that had enormous challenges. Populations were becoming more diverse. That created challenges of identity, of national sense of oneself. Same thing's happening now as we move from an industrial economy to an information economy. The rise of a mass media is usually a very, very telling sign for dictatorship, because dictators, political leaders who master the means of communication of their era can move millions. Hitler understood the radio. FDR understood the radio. So people who understand how to reach followers where they live are to be reckoned with. It was the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, and Wilson, who'd been born in Virginia, who had Southern sympathies and was a Democrat, and a huge part of the Democratic base in that era was among white segregationist Southerners. He went and gave an address that had very little to do with Lincoln and a lot to do with the lost cause. It was what was thought of as reconciliation. It was that this was a national struggle, that there was equal valor and equal weight to the arguments on both sides, which of course would have surprised those who had fought for the Union. It was really a kind of high water mark of the revisionism about the Civil War, trying to make it less about race and more about valor and American identity, as broadly put as possible. And it would take another 50, 60 years before really the popular imagination came to see the war as what it had been, which was a struggle over slavery and power. Birth of a Nation feels like a very primitive movie, right? It doesn't flow in the way we think of cinema, but for its time, it was quite advanced. And it was a storytelling device of the modern world, telling a story of the old world, of a world that had faded. It was very much about white supremacy. The actors are in blackface. There are scenes of anxiety because a white woman's about to be taken away by a person of color. It's every possible stereotype you can imagine is played out in Birth of a Nation. And it had an electrifying effect around the country. It was a huge success, financially, commercially, culturally, because it affirmed this white view of the war and Reconstruction not as the natural result of a struggle over slavery, but of somehow a battle of Northern aggression against Southern valor and Southern mores. And it was curiously, for 1915, curiously really belonged to 1845. It was a movie out of time, yet all too tragically, it did represent the prevailing racial views in a huge part of the country. Well, stereotypes become stereotypes because there's some truth to them, right? It's like cliches are cliches because they work. Sure, there are regional distinctions, regional characteristics that, whether it's accents or customs or mores, but to be prisoners of stereotypes, either in reality or in rhetoric, is particularly counterproductive because we all, I think, in our lives have to figure out a way to overcome what our intrinsic instincts are. And our intrinsic instincts are pretty much selfish. Not all of them, but a good many. And so the story of growing up, the story of a human journey in many ways, is learning how to reach out, to be gracious when you're inclined to be selfish, and that certainly plays out regionally. My part of Tennessee was not hugely shaped by the lost cause, at least my universe wasn't. I grew up on Missionary Ridge, a battlefield in Chattanooga. It's where Arthur MacArthur, Douglas MacArthur's father, won his Medal of Honor when he was 17 years old. I grew up about 700-800 yards from Braxton Bragg's headquarters, the Confederate commander, but about 3 miles that way was Chief John Ross's house of the Cherokee Nation. So you had this embodiment of the twin original sins of the American experience right there: African American slavery, Native American removal. So though I grew up in a place where the Civil War was ambient, we weren't really refighting it, at least in my household and in the world I grew up in. Very aware of the significance of the battlefields around, but by the 1970s and 80s, at least in my part of the world, blessedly, we'd moved on. When I was little, you could still find Manet balls, Civil War bullets on Missionary Ridge and around. And so to me, history was just right there. It was something you went and tried to dig around for. And I think that shaped how I think, because it's at once remote and at hand, which is true of the larger drama of history as well. Faulkner said wonderfully in Requiem for a Nun that the past is never dead, it isn't even past. And it's one of those tropes. I probably use it too much. But it's true. And there's something, I don't know if it's comparatively, if Southerners are more susceptible to that. I know plenty of New Englanders who still think that the Mayflower just pulled out. But I do think because so much of the war unfolded, so much of the Civil War unfolded here. If you're driving on, here's a great scene. Think about this. If you're driving on Interstate 75 in the American South, which I think is how a lot of folks get to Disneyland or Disney World, whatever it is. If you're driving on an interstate in the American South, you're driving on a road that was built by Dwight Eisenhower, sponsored by Al Gore Sr. and Prescott Bush, showing you some of the intimacies of history, on a system that was built for Cold War defense in case we had to have massive mobilization in the event of nuclear attack or invasion from the Soviet Union. But you're driving past Civil War sites where people with muskets and cannons and cavalry charges were fighting over the nature of identity and power, 150 years ago. And in those days, less than 100 years ago. So the American story feels so vast. I mean, my God, to Lexington and Concord to here, the Niagara movement to here, it seems so extraordinary. It's all the day before yesterday. I mean, we're 240-something years old. That's a blink in the eye. I found that one of the most exciting things to do intellectually, and which is not a word I would have used when this started, is to look at something that's totally commonly accepted and ask why. So here's a good example. Why is this the second decade of the 21st century? What does that mean exactly? Why is it 21 centuries? How do we start to tell time? Well, it goes back to the birth of Jesus of Nazareth. That's how the West decided to structure its calendar. So it seems to me it's a fairly self-evident question to then ask, how on earth did that happen? How did a Jewish peasant born at the corner of an empire become the central cultural figure for more than half the world? And I can't tell you exactly when that started, but those are the kinds of questions. Look at a monument. There are always monuments you just drive by, right? I'm sure there are in your neighborhood, there are in my neighborhood, and asking why they're there. This will surprise you that I was a strange child. I know it'll become as a shock to you. But I remember reading William Manchester's biography of Douglas MacArthur called American Caesar. And it opens on Missionary Ridge, not far. I'm sure he was somewhere near where I grew up, because Manchester, as a great biographer, wanted to go to the beginnings of the myth. And the myth of MacArthur was, how could I match my father, who at the age of 17 won the Medal of Honor in the Civil War? And the description of the world I knew, seeing it in a book, in print, I think triggered something, which suggested that what was familiar to me could be worthy of commemoration and communication to others. My grandfather was born in 1913, classic Southern lawyer, was frustrated, had wanted to go to the Naval Academy, but his mother, who I think was quite a battle axe, thought that a landlocked boy didn't need to be going off to the oceans. So he was at Vanderbilt Law School, went back to Chattanooga to practice, and then the war came, of course, and he spent 4 years in the Pacific as a gunnery officer, and came back and lived kind of the classic Eisenhower era ethos. By the time I came along, he'd gone on the bench and took me down to court. I used to sit on the bench with him in the city court of Chattanooga. God knows what the defendants must have thought. That must have been very frustrating. But it was fascinating. And he would take me, he had coffee with his friends every weekday morning at an old hotel in Chattanooga called the Reed House. And so the mayor would be there, and the police commissioner, and the old DA, who was about 112 then. He was probably 70, That's how things, but my sense was he was a Methuselah. And so I heard all these stories. I just heard both conversations about what was going on in the life of the country, but also what was going on locally, refracted through these, straightforward courthouse types. And one of the things that I'm convinced it did is, A, it made politics fascinating, and it made it very human, because these were guys going out to win votes and running campaigns. And so I would see them there, but then I'd see their name on a sign out in the city. And so I could connect those two things. And the other thing that was fascinating was connecting the men I saw on the news or read about in the newspaper with the ones I actually had been around and heard. And when you think about it, that's a huge part of the biographical enterprise, is either reconciling those two persona, seeing that they're constant, or pointing out that they're irreconcilable. So that's really what a biographer does. And so I think I don't use the word fated, but I'm convinced that that was a huge part of why I got interested in what I do. I went into journalism when I was 18. The Chattanooga Times, which was Adolph Ox's first newspaper, Ruth Homburg, his granddaughter, and Paul Neely, the editor, sweetly hired me. I had no qualifications whatever, but I wrote a couple of stories that first summer, went back a couple more summers, went back after I went to college for a year and a half or so. Loved it. And it's a disappearing world, that size newsroom. That was a 40,000, 45,000 circulation paper. But it was just, it was straight out of a movie, Too much drinking and a lot of chasing stories that probably didn't matter a huge amount to the course of civilization, but we thought they did. Around 1991, 92, I was covering local politics in North Georgia, which was right over the line from Chattanooga. And I remember going to rallies in that year. Pat Buchanan was running in the primaries. Buchanan actually did well in that part of the state. And I remember going, and there were religious conservatives with signs, very respectful people, who had homemade poster board that had all these social indicators, divorce rates, crime rates, all dated not from 1973, which is the Roe decision, obviously, but from 1962, which was the school prayer decision that declared sectarian compulsory school prayer in public schools unconstitutional. And I'd never seen the drama of the conservative world pinpointed there. I always thought 73 is the beginning of everything, and all of this is a reaction to abortion. It wasn't. That was an exacerbating factor for them, obviously. But it really began with the Supreme Court and the fact that an Eisenhower court, created in many ways by a Republican, had seemingly betrayed their values. I don't think I was a very good newspaper reporter. My editor, Paul Neely, used to say, please don't quote Edmund Burke anymore when I was writing about North Georgia politics. A fair point. Yes, it was, President Bush was running for re-election. The South was moving from having been solidly Democratic, though going Republican in presidential elections, to becoming deep, what we would later call deep red. So I was there right on the edge. I remember covering the Georgia legislature in the early 90s, and there was one Republican from North Georgia in the Georgia House of Representatives. Now, if you're a Democrat, you couldn't get arrested. I mean, it's just that. So I was there right at that pivot point. And it was interesting because President Bush Sr. was very much part of the sane world. My first conscious political memory was being allowed to stay up to watch Richard Nixon resign, which would have been 9 o'clock Eastern Time on August 8th, 1974, Thursday night. And I remember, and then a couple years later, when the Watergate book started coming out, I started reading about it, because it was sort of fascinating. It was like a real-life Narnia, it had heroes and villains, and Bernstein and Woodward's The Final Days. I remember very clearly reading that early on. And the drama of politics, the human part of it, was totally fascinating. What I made of all that was that politics was this crazy world where sometimes great things happened and sometimes terrible things happened. I remember reading about, Martha Mitchell making slightly drunken phone calls to reporters, and I was like, that happened in my family. Right? It just happens, and I hadn't thought about it exactly this way until right this second, but I'm sure that there's some connection there. The big moment for me was in 1986. I read two books, All the King's Men by Robert Penn Warren and The Wise Men by Walter Isaacson and Evan Thomas. And that was transformative as well, because you have in many ways, the great American novel in Warren's hands. It's about Willie Stark, who's really like Huey Long, but it's, as ever, it's mixed. He's light and he's dark and he's trying. And then Walter and Evan had written this marvelous book about Averell Harriman and Dean Acheson, the foreign policy elite that had shaped the post-war world. And I remember in both cases, I finished the book and then started it again. And years later, when I was having a job interview for Newsweek with Evan, I told him this story. And I said I was a senior in high school, and I read your book, and then I started again. And he said, "God, you must have been a loser." Which was a fair point. I went from the Chattanooga paper to work for Charlie Peters at the Washington Monthly. Charlie's a fabulous man. He really kind of helped revolutionize journalism. Wanted the Democratic Party to be culturally sensitive to what is seen as more conservative elements. There was a famous Washington Monthly cover in the 70s saying criminals belong in jail, which was kind of a radical thing to say in the McGovern era. And Charlie was vital. Taught me details mattered enormously. Never think of something you need to do and think, okay, I'll do that later. If you see it, say it, do it. And it taught me also that publishing, that journalism was really an all-in thing. It was totally consuming. There was no doing it halfway. And then I went to Newsweek and in New York, and I was there for 15 years. I loved Newsweek. I'd grown up with it and Time, and that was how the world came to you, pre-internet. The weekly news magazines were hugely important, particularly to somebody growing up in Tennessee. The arguments made in the magazine were made with some brevity, but one of the things you learn is that if you can't make an argument briefly, you probably haven't got it. You may not have an argument to make. And so I never thought that somehow or another it was anti-intellectual or skimming the surface. I'm convinced that because I loved books when I was a kid, I was a terrible athlete, so I had to. That was kind of the choice, though they're not mutually exclusive. Growing up where I grew up, where history was ambient and not particularly divisive, right? I mean, it wasn't a lost cause world. It wasn't, I'm not some survivalist escapee. It's not that at all. Growing up where I grew up, loving big narrative nonfiction, and loving politics, both for, the way into this was the human drama of it. I wasn't sitting, when I was growing up thinking, if only we could do this with Medicare Part B, we would be okay. My interest was in the struggle and the personalities that did the struggling. And so journalism was a natural place to land. And it sure as hell beat law school. I went to 3 schools in my life, and they were all religiously affiliated, more or less. I went to an Episcopal Montessori, a nominally Presbyterian secondary school, and an Episcopal college. And if you look at the Anglican tradition, it's all about scripture, reason, and tradition. But reason and tradition are right in there. And so I'm convinced that the teachers I had and the institutions I was part of certainly helped me think in the way I think, insofar as I think. If the 2016 election had gone the other way, I wouldn't have written about the soul of America. I'm not so arrogant or self-involved to think that I can say, here are the 4 points that will lead us forward. But what I can do is try to take advantage of the fact that I've spent most of my life thinking about the past and thinking about how the past became something either worth emulating or worth avoiding. My hope with all of this, with the arguments I make, the case studies I try to bring forward, is not that somehow or another it will instantly bring perfection to the world, but it may give us a sense of proportion. It may enable people, when they're looking at a headline, when they're looking at the chyron on cable, when they're looking at their phone, when they're just about to explode, either side, whatever's going on, they might say, well, you know what, we got through Fort Sumter, so maybe I can not have my head explode right this minute. I've been incredibly lucky, beautifully educated, professionally fortunate. Some folks want to read or listen to what I have to say, which is hugely flattering and an honor. I have an obligation to repay their time and attention with something that is worthwhile. And I think that if you make a historically based argument, if you tell the story of someone within the biographical construction, that it has its own rules, of course. But in the end, you do want the reader, the listener, to find something illuminating for their own lives and their own time, so that it's not, my view is that history, there's a purely clinical way of looking at it, and that's great. For me, it's more about, let's tell this story and then let's talk about what we can learn from it. I don't think of writing as lonely, partly because I'm a biographer, and so by definition, I'm in conversation, virtual conversation, with both the subject and all the people who have done remarkable work about that subject through the years. And so I don't think of it as a lonely enterprise. It's frustrating, it's hard sometimes, but I'm always, whenever I'm feeling sorry for myself, I'm reminded of an old H.L. Mencken line that when writers feel sorry for themselves, they could go out and work on an assembly line and they would be fine. And that will send you back to your typewriter pretty quickly. But I think of this as being part of a conversation. You know, I've written about people about whom much has been written. Andrew Jackson, Thomas Jefferson. And I've written about people where it's kind of the beginning of the conversation, George H.W. Bush. But it is a conversation. I don't think there's such a thing as a definitive biography, because is any one life ever definitive? I think that this is a big, disputatious, complex marketplace of ideas, and that there's plenty of room for all of us. Am I disappointed sometimes at how stuff is received? Sure. I mean, if you're, whenever you write something, what you're really hoping is that people would just say, not since Isaiah has there been such a master of prose. That happens very rarely. But, look, it's, you can't be for the First Amendment for yourself and then be against it for others. That's the damnable thing about it. So it's 1924, really the high water mark in many ways of the second Ku Klux Klan. There's a Georgia politician named Clifford Walker who had run for governor and lost. He then became more closely associated, joined the Klan, and he won. And he gave a speech out in Kansas City at a Klan meeting saying that he wanted to build a wall of steel as high as heaven to keep Southern Europeans out, Italians, Greeks. Build a wall of steel as high as heaven. And again, the rhetoric of isolationism, of nativism, of that's the other, we need to get rid of the other so that we can be what we, whoever we is, was the prevailing sentiment of that time. A politician's natural instinct is to govern for those who brought him to the dance. They already support you. They support you because you support causes they want. We call it the base. They're the folks that you take care of. History tells us, though, that greatness in the sweep of time is often granted to those who don't simply govern for the base. In the 1920s, you had politicians who were governing for the Klan. You have Reconstruction politicians who were governing for the white supremacists. But the presidents we tend to remember fondly are those who surprise us and who do something that the base either doesn't like or is forced to learn to like. When FDR died in 1945, there were people who said, I never met him, but I feel as though I just lost my best friend. There were people who put signs in the windows that said, a death in the family, in store windows. There were GIs, of course, who really had never known another president. He'd been president since 1933. It had been 12 years. So if you'd been 7 or 8 years old, that was your president. People didn't know who Harry Truman was. He was a monumental figure in the life of the country, not least because he was the first president to fully inhabit radio. His voice was familiar to them. His voice was as familiar to the country as subsequent presidents' visages would be. So he was ubiquitous, because speed is relative, right? And that sort of thing is relative. And there were those who believed he was God. And there was 40% of the country that couldn't say his name. They called him that man. So when we try to sentimentalize the past, when we try to say, oh, this era is so much different, if only we could be like the 1930s or 40s, 40% of the country never voted for Franklin Roosevelt. At best, we're a 60-40 country. And most of the time, it's 51-49. I just think that's important to remember to keep things in perspective. Franklin Roosevelt is no paragon here. He interred the Japanese Americans. He resisted anti-lynching legislation. But we have to judge people on the totality of their lives and the totality of what they accomplished within the context of their era. And by that standard, Franklin Roosevelt is one of the greatest executive leaders we ever had. The thing about executive power is you're always against it until you have it. And you're against it if someone you don't like is exercising it, but then you're all for it if someone you like is. The story of the American presidency has been a gradual and sometimes rapid accretion of power. Very unlikely that gets rolled back in a significant way anytime soon. It's why the presidency matters so much, not simply for its cultural role, but the person in that chair, the person behind that desk, does have a remarkable ability to set the tone, tenor, but also the actual policy of the country. Seems obvious to say that, but a lot of people sometimes say, well, you're exaggerating the role of the presidency. It's also about mayors. It's also about absolutely true. But if you have that kind of executive power, Article II power, as it's called under the Constitution, you want someone sane doing it. I don't think that's a particularly radical proposition. In the wake of Pearl Harbor, there were anxieties, particularly along the West Coast, that Japanese Americans might serve as agents of the Japanese imperial government, an enemy force. The Attorney General of California, Earl Warren, and others argued that there should be an internment program that, as a national security measure, people of foreign descent were dangerous, were potentially enemies of the country. And so FDR issued Executive Order 9066, interning Japanese Americans. It's one of our most shameful episodes in American history. And a reminder that even in the midst of a global campaign to defend liberty and to fight tyranny, someone as otherwise remarkable as Franklin Roosevelt was able to make a serious miscalculation and a decision that violated fundamental principles of both human and American rights. For Roosevelt, this decision would have been about politics mostly. The West Coast was fearful, and he wanted to make sure he did everything he could, both to secure the country, but also to reassure those who were anxious. And so he made a wartime decision, a hasty wartime decision. In war, civil liberties do not do well. It happened in the First World War. It happened in the Second World War. It happened in the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus. So in times of war, presidents, more often than not, curb civil liberties in the name of broader national security concerns. What changed everything was Pearl Harbor and the fact that bombs had been dropped, Americans had died, war had been brought to us by the Japanese, led to that remarkable reaction. Out of the First World War, there was an enormous amount of anxiety that more global engagement would lead to entanglements, debt, the power of the few over the many. And so America First, which was founded at Yale, so not a Midwestern thing, very much in the heart of the American elite, the isolationist movement was centrally based on the idea that our oceans would protect us and that we should not be drawn into foreign quarrels, foreign entanglements, because someone was always taking advantage of us. There was a populist streak in the isolationist movement. It was the same thing that people would argue in more domestic populist moments. It was that someone is taking advantage of us, and we need to be smart because they think they're smarter than us. And in this case, it was the old world. We don't want to be outsmarted. And Lindbergh, Charles Lindbergh, ironically, given that he had proven how small the world was because he had crossed the Atlantic in an airplane, becomes the central voice for this. The voice for what he called, in a phrase we might hear again, the silent majority. FDR dealt with isolationism incredibly carefully. He believed, as he once put it, that you can never get too far ahead of your followers because you might look back and no one's there. He knew that the country was uninterested in fighting another global war. He knew that to be in place, to make decisions that he thought he should make, he had to maneuver incredibly carefully and in many ways be deceptive. He once said, "I'm a juggler. I never let my left hand know what my right hand is doing." And that was certainly true. Late 1940 campaign, he says, "Your boys are not going to be sent to fight in any foreign wars." And Wendell Willkie, the Republican nominee, said, "That son of a bitch, that's going to beat me." And it did. It's true that great presidents have known ultimately where they wanted to go and have managed to hold on to power long enough to get at least close. Lincoln was a skeptic on this. He once said that I admit plainly that events have controlled me. He was reacting to reality. But even within that, how you react within the constraints of a time, you have a choice. Crises are about moments of decision where fate is decided. The initial meaning of the word crisis goes back to health. It's whether you decide whether you're going to live or you're going to die. And so in political life, crises present certain choices. Lincoln made the choices he made. FDR made the choices he made. Lyndon Johnson made the choices he made, each with a sense that they knew where they wanted to go. And they might not get there with this decision or that decision or even another decision, but that there was a place, that they knew the hill they wanted to get to. And I think that's what separates truly great leaders from people who are simply marking time in positions of authority. In the second week of April 1945, FDR goes down to Warm Springs to his cottage in Georgia. And he's working on a Jefferson birthday address. Jefferson's birthday is April 13th. And some of the last sentences we know he wrote included, "The only limit to the realization of our hopes for tomorrow will be our doubts of today. We must move forward with strong and active faith." And they were in many ways his last words. He was a politician and a person who always preferred thinking ahead and hoping as opposed to fearing. Sounds banal. But if you've been struck down by polio, and if you've managed to come back into the arena, you know that that journey is possible. You know that you can move from fear to hope. And he fundamentally understood that the best American presidents, the best American eras, were ones where you talked about strong and active faith. You talked about what he called in the same speech, the science of human relationships. You talked about, as he put it in his final inaugural, that the only way to have a friend is to be one in the new world. All of those messages, which can seem like we're talking about needlepoint pillows or coffee mugs or something, or just being a homiletic, it was true for him. And the proof is in the fact that when he died that day, the country dissolved in an emotional wave in many ways. And that when we look back, we see someone who confronted two of the greatest crises in American history, and we came out stronger, ultimately, than we went in. And believe me, if it had gone another way, we would hold him accountable. So justice requires giving him credit. Eleanor Roosevelt always reminded Franklin Roosevelt of why he was truly there. She was a goad, a conscience, a source of perennial reminders that our better angels had to continue to fight our worst instincts. She had become his eyes and ears and legs long before. She had found her own work in civil rights and progressive causes and women's causes, everything you can think of. One of the greatest women who ever lived, one of the greatest people who ever lived, Eleanor Roosevelt. And when FDR was thinking that he would go a little slower on this or that, she would be right there. And it drove him crazy. He'd be sitting there just trying to have a drink at the end of the day, and she would come in with a basket of letters and things he should do, and he was just, oh God, here we go again. I've often thought of Lionel Trilling's line, the literary critic. He once said of Fanny in Mansfield Park, Jane Austen's novel, that an evening with Fanny would not be undertaken lightly. An evening with Mrs. Roosevelt would not be undertaken lightly. She was a very serious person. And yet, the plight of a lot of folks is a lot better today because she was. There's a school of thought that one of the reasons Earl Warren was as devoted as he was to the Brown versus Board decision in 1954 was that there was some guilt because of the Japanese internment. That's a subject of great debate. But Warren is a great example, Chief Justice Warren, of the dual nature of reality. He was wrong about internment, and he was right about integration. FDR was right about the war and wrong about internment. It's just Lincoln was right about emancipation, but he was wrong about leaving slavery in place for the 2 years he did. So if you want someone perfect, write a novel. After the war, Vinegar Joe Stilwell, Pacific commander, comes to California and goes to award a citation to a regiment of Japanese Americans. And there was a young Hollywood actor who gave a talk at the same ceremony talking about how we might come from different places, but the blood we shed on the beaches in the cause of liberty was all the same color. And that was a young man named Ronald Reagan, who then, as president 40 years later, would apologize for the Japanese internment. I think the ultimate apology for the internment, the prevailing view that it was the wrong thing, is a cautionary tale for us, which is that when we have focused our fire, literally and figuratively, on particular groups, we have almost always come to regret it in the fullness of time. So African Americans, women, Japanese Americans during internment. Will that be true of immigrants today? I would bet yes, because of the historical pattern. If you demonize, if you select out people based on ethnicity or nationality, whatever it is, you're really not acting in the full spirit of the American Revolution, which is that we have to find a way to open that definition of what Jefferson meant. And I don't understand why history doesn't have more of an impact on these decisions in real time. I do understand because it's emotional and it's fear-based and all that. But part of my argument is whenever you want to say this group is bad, this group must be discriminated against, think back and find a case where we've decided that, where the mainstream decided that, and didn't come to regret it. We always end up apologizing. So why don't we not do what we have to, why don't we not do the thing that we apologize for in the first place? Could we try that maybe once? Capitalism survived the 1930s for a whole host of reasons. The industrial output of the Second World War, the New Deal played its role. The prosperity that came after the war was really unparalleled in terms of its widespread impact. The creation of the post-war middle class is one of the great stories in history. And I don't think it's a coincidence that it was a prosperous America that ultimately undid Jim Crow and ultimately passed the Voting Rights Act, because enough people who looked like me felt they were doing well enough that we could extend a hand. People who are interested in social reform would do very well to be interested in broad-based prosperity too, because the fear that keeps people from extending their hand is often based on an economic anxiety. And if they're doing well, if they're feeling secure in their own place in the world, they are far more likely to widen the definition of the mainstream than they are if they're feeling economic pressure. The American story is of private enterprise and the public sector working together. And whether it's the Transcontinental Railroad or the creation of land-grant universities, the internal improvements before that, the interstate highways, the GI Bill, public schools, it's Cold War spending. There's no question that the public sector has fueled private prosperity, and there's no question that private enterprise has created innumerable jobs and opportunity. And I think trying to say one is all good or one is all bad is ahistorical. People who are anti-government are usually doing so, in a house lit by the TVA after they've driven on an interstate built by Dwight Eisenhower shortly before they cashed a Social Security check. if you're looking for an emblem of the absolute ideological rigidity of the age, there was a sign at an Obamacare rally where someone held up a sign that said, "I want the government to keep their hands off my Medicare." And you don't really have to know anything else. If I were trying to craft a big government-centric policy these days, I don't think I would use the New Deal. I think I'd use the Marshall Plan, the rebuilding of Europe, as the example. The New Deal conjures up this vast bureaucracy that, as President Reagan said, the closest thing to eternal life on earth is a government program. And so it's still in the brain stem of the American public. The New Deal can put people off. Nobody's against the Marshall Plan. That was an act of generosity. It rebuilt Europe. It created stability. It created security. It helped us win the Cold War. And it's limited. People think of the New Deal as a perpetual thing, which in many ways it has been. The Marshall Plan is a focused attack on something, the solution to a given problem. We feared big government long before the Civil War, and that was Jefferson versus Hamilton. The anxiety about the power of the state versus the power of the individual is as fundamental to the American dynamic as anything. And it predates the Civil War, it postdates the Civil War. It's intellectually dubious because we don't really define what we mean anymore by government versus private sector necessarily. But I think that there's no doubt that, well, let me put it this way. There's something about the American spirit that bounces us from guardrail to guardrail, right? So now that we have this right-wing populist, who knows what happens next? I mean, you could end up on the far left again fairly quickly because we tend to go from extreme to extreme. So Joe McCarthy becomes a national force on Lincoln's birthday in 1950, Wheeling, West Virginia. He gives a speech saying he has in his pocket the names of 253, I think, 257 communists in the Department of State. Never really found any. There had been communists in the government, but they had been driven out mostly by Truman in a loyalty program that upset civil libertarians. McCarthy, his own lawyer, Roy Cohn, said, was an opportunist. He'd bought communism the way other people might buy a car. It was a vehicle. It was a means to an end. He rose to power, interestingly, in a radio and newspaper world where his charges were sensational and immediately transmitted to the world. It's very interesting that he fell in a TV world, that people who watched what was unfolding decided that's not who we want to be. Or at least that's not who we want to be right now. And my sense is that both Edward R. Murrow's program, which basically just showed McCarthy being McCarthy, and then McCarthy's own performance during the Army McCarthy hearings of being a bully, made people think this isn't what we want to do. Now, they thought that after 4 years of it. These things take time. That was 4 years. Watergate was 27 months. It's not the work of a news cycle. There was a huge amount of debate during the McCarthy era about whether a journalistic institution should simply report what was said, broadcast what was said, without assessing its validity, without telling readers or viewers this is true or not true. This sounds somewhat familiar. And there was a lot of discussion, a lot of argument about, do you take McCarthy and treat him as a different kind of thing than simply the old news test of a United States senator says there's a communist loose in Iowa, therefore we must write that a United States senator said there's a communist loose in Iowa. Just because someone in power says something, does that make it news? And if it does make it news, does the journalistic organization have an obligation to assess the validity of what was said? The 1950s really saw the birth, or at least the growth, of politics as entertainment. It became a serialization. It was serialized in the papers, it was serialized on radio, and ultimately on television. And Richard Hofstadter, the great Columbia historian, said that it's now possible to keep the mass of men in a state of constant political ferment because you have characters, you have drama, you have shifting scenes. It's really kind of like, dare I say it, a reality TV series. McCarthyism fell not least because enough people said, this is hysterical. This is not, in fact, a proportionate response to what's unfolding. And reason won out. It's actually quite a reassuring story. It took a long time. Lives were ruined. Took 4 years. But ultimately, McCarthy falls from power because enough people realized there was not a red under every bed, as the phrase went. And I think the fall of McCarthy is an incredibly important case study in how reason can ultimately triumph over passion. The anti-communism of the era was a passionate thing. You felt the existential question. And why wouldn't you? Nuclear weapons, unfolding struggle, people who would be inside the government trying to undo things. Totally makes sense. It's an amazing drama. But ultimately, we decided, you know what? People who know a lot about this say it's not that big a deal. In many ways, the conservative movement that has a connection with conspiracy theories begins in the aftermath of the Second World War. There was anxiety about the way FDR had handled Yalta. People thought that he had sold us out. That quickly moved into a anti-communist conspiratorial world where Eisenhower was seen as a dedicated agent of the communist conspiracy. George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff during World War II, was seen as a communist agent. There was this ferment of completely wild and untrue views that the power structure was somehow working with the Soviets against ordinary Americans, which plays in, yet again, to this recurring theme that there is some force, foreigners, powerful people, rich people, who are trying to undo the America that is most familiar and most beloved to those who are listening to the conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories are perennial. Richard Hofstadter called it the paranoid style in American politics. They ebb and they flow. There are completely respectable conservative voices in the post-war era, William F. Buckley being chief among them. But there are also, for every Buckley, there's a John Birch Society in the 1950s. You have an incredibly fraught debate about the nature of freedom, the nature of our defense against the Soviets. It's Friday, November 22nd, 1963. It's a sunny day in Dallas. Kennedy and Johnson are in Texas trying to bring peace to the two wings of the Democratic Party in preparation for the 1964 election. Kennedy is shot to death in Daley Plaza. Johnson becomes president, takes the oath of office on Air Force One. They fly back to Washington. They don't know at that point to what extent this might be a widespread conspiracy. That night, Johnson is lying in bed in his house in Washington, a house called the Elms, and he's listing off things he wants to do. Foreign leaders that need to be called, funeral arrangements. But in the midst of this, he says he wants to pass the administration's civil rights bill without changing a comma. The bill that had come into being after the standoff in the schoolhouse door with George Wallace in Alabama in June of that year. And it was kind of a remarkable moment because Johnson had a presidential race coming up. The reason they'd been in Texas is they were worried about the South. No more political man ever drew breath than Lyndon Baines Johnson. Everything about that moment would have led him politically to have made all kinds of promises, all kinds of rhetorical nods to the civil rights legislation, but not to pursue it. There was something in Johnson's soul that led him to believe that this was the moment to strike. And as he later put it, what the hell's the presidency for if not to do the big things that other men might not? What the hell's the presidency for? And he had a very clear vision that it was for doing big things that would loom large in the lives of people and ultimately in the life of history. Johnson had been a senator from Texas, a segregated state. A lot of debate about to what extent he watered down civil rights legislation in the 50s, but he did. He was in no way a leading progressive. He'd been put on the ticket in part because the New England liberals needed a Southern conservative in the Democratic Party of that time. And so you wouldn't have bet on that afternoon in Dallas or en route back to Andrews aboard Air Force One that Lyndon Johnson was going to try to finish the work of Lincoln. The story of civil rights in the post-war era in many ways begins with Harry Truman. He integrates the military in 1948. That creates a huge backlash. A lot of conservative Democrats left the party over that. In 1954, the Brown decision orders school integration. In 1955, there's an enforcement decision that means we really mean it, you got to do this. But by 1964, there had been enough nonviolent activism that the full panoply of segregation was under attack. Kennedy, after George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, steps in and says he's going to stop the integration of the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. They propose a far-reaching Civil Rights Act. It was not going particularly well in Congress, which was dominated by white Southern Democrats, until the assassination. And what Johnson then did from 63 to 64 is he created a remarkable coalition of Republicans and Democrats to pass a law that would finally undo what had been the racist reaction to the verdict of the Civil War. Lyndon Johnson was one of the great persuaders in American politics. The Johnson treatment, it was called. He would feel you. He wouldn't do very well now. He was always grabbing folks. And one of the ways he pushed the case for civil rights was he would tell the story about his housekeeper or his aides, both male and female, who were African American, who would have to stop on the way back from Washington to Texas to urinate on the side of the road because they couldn't use public facilities. He used the particular to illustrate the universal. He also used the broad sweep of history. He weaponized history in a very effective way. He's sitting in the Oval Office with George Wallace one day, and Wallace has been launching a counterattack against the protesters on Bloody Sunday, the Selma to Montgomery March. And Johnson puts him on a couch where he sinks down, and Wallace was a little guy anyway. Johnson was a big guy. Johnson's looming over him largely. And he says, George, what do you want people to say on your tombstone? Do you want to say George Wallace, he hated, or George Wallace, he built? And it was clear that in Johnson's mind, you want it said of you that you built. And he really, I think, brilliantly appealed to a politician's vanity to do the right thing. And that's a hell of a combination. You can appeal to do the right thing, or you can appeal to their vanity. It's the truly great moments where you can do both. Johnson's historical stock is complicated. Obviously, the deep unpopularity of the Vietnam War, which drove him from office in 1968, has driven him from, I think, the full light and appreciation of history. That's changing somewhat, as these things do. But here's a man, again, whom you wouldn't have bet on, like Truman. Wouldn't have bet on Truman being a transformative figure. You might not have bet on Lyndon Johnson being a transformative figure, who did remarkable things. And was he perfect? Hell no. God, no. But is the country better off because of what he did on certain issues? Yeah, it is. Lyndon Johnson's a vivid case of the best the presidency can be and sometimes the worst politicians can be. He understood that being on a great stage required great action, required a breadth of vision, but he was a particularly sensitive politician. Strongly disliked slights. I don't know anyone who likes being slighted, so I should add that. But he was always politically attuned to a remarkable degree. And that created a kind of internal drama that I suspect took a huge amount of wear and tear. He never got over the fact that he thought the Kennedys didn't give him enough credit. He was always anxious and insecure about his social and educational credentials, even when he becomes one of the most powerful presidents in American history. But none of that is to criticize him. It's just to say that's what happens in this most human of businesses. Politics is not clinical. It's not. It is as human as it gets. And Johnson was as human as you got. Johnson believed in drawing on his life experiences. When he argued for the Voting Rights Act, he talked about how he had taught poor Mexican children and who had been made so desperate by poverty, and that becoming president gave him an immense amount of power in order to help them. As a Texan, as a Southerner, he had a certain credibility with the region that needed the most reform, but they turned on him. I mean, it wasn't as though, Johnson going to civil rights was like Nixon going to China. Goldwater, the states Barry Goldwater carried in 1964 were the states that were in Johnson's native region. The key thing about Johnson, I think, is that he saw the country whole. And I don't mean to be sentimental about it, but that matters. He saw that being president meant rising above sectional concerns, rising above his old constituency. And I think that's one of the reasons he was able to make that leap from senator to vice president to president in terms of a widening breadth of vision, is he understood that he was president of everybody. And the great presidents have understood that. Politicians want to be reelected. That's kind of the oxygen they breathe. And sometimes they'll say, it doesn't matter, I will stand on principle. And sometimes they mean it. George H.W. Bush meant it on taxes in 1990. Lyndon Johnson said it a couple of times. I don't think he particularly meant it. Ultimately, he gave up the presidency. One of the fascinating things about this whole world is you have these intensely ambitious, driven people who are in a sphere of life where you're ultimately judged by how you transcend being ambitious and driven. So it's an inherent tension. You have to be tough and strong and egotistical to win great political power. And then when you have great political power, you're expected to rise above the kind of conflicts that you mastered and won to get there. So actually, we have a fairly high expectation. We don't think about it much, but a fairly high expectation of political leaders. They frequently disappoint. It's why we only talk about a handful in terms of, we need to be more like X or Y. There aren't that many X or Ys. Lyndon Johnson risked just about everything for civil rights. Now, he won an incredible victory that year. He was lucky in his opponent. Barry Goldwater was seen as too extreme. Johnson was playing for this conversation. He was playing for, and that sounds dismissive, I don't mean that. He was playing for the ages. He wanted to be Franklin Roosevelt. He wanted to be Abraham Lincoln. He wanted people to put him in that paragraph, in the paragraph of those who transcended the circumstances of their time and expanded liberty, expanded what Jefferson meant when he wrote that we're all created equal. That's what Lyndon Johnson wanted. He wanted something big, and he got it, and he fought for it, and we have to give him credit for it. It's really important when we talk about civil rights in the 20th century to realize that we give Truman credit for integrating the military, we give Eisenhower credit for responding to Little Rock, we give Johnson credit for finishing the work of Lincoln and undoing Jim Crow, but they were reacting to innumerable acts of courage from people whose names we know and don't know. Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, the people who marched and fought and died for this cause. Change in America comes when the powerful take notice of what the powerless have been saying. And on civil rights, and you see it in the relationship between Kennedy and Johnson and Dr. King, the presidency was a lagging indicator, not a leading indicator. It was when Kennedy watched Dr. King give his speech to the March on Washington, and when it was over, he said, "He's damn good." He appreciated, the performer in him understood what King was doing. The complicated calculus, the trade-offs, the deals cut to get to a legislative solution for the problems of injustice that were being pointed out in the great iconic moments is the work of politics. And Lyndon Johnson in particular gets great credit because it would have been easy to have punted on this. To have said, you know what, I'm not going to deal with this until after the election. He dealt with it during the election. He was willing to take the risk. Martin Luther King understood America in fundamental ways. At Kennedy's funeral in Washington, Walter Fauntleroy, an associate of King's, says to Dr. King, civil rights will really pass now. Now we're going to get it. And King looked at him and said, we're a 10-day nation, Walter. We basically have an attention span that lasts about 10 days. Now it's about 10 minutes or so. But King understood that public attention and a public appetite for change came and went. Civil Rights Act was really about enforcing the 14th Amendment, the idea of equal access. There was no special legislation, though, to try to enforce the 15th Amendment, the right giving African American men the right to vote. And so there was a voter registration march planned from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama. It was Sunday, March 7th, 1965. John Lewis, young man, head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He'd been born with a stutter. He learned to speak by preaching to the chickens in his family's yard in Troy, Alabama. Lewis and Hosea Williams are leading the march. They go across the Pettus Bridge. Lewis had packed for jail. He packed a toothbrush, a book, some fruit. They come down the bridge. The Alabama troopers and possemen say, there'll be no march today. Lewis says, may we kneel and pray. He kneels, the possemen come after him and nearly beat him to death. It had happened 1,000 times or more in the American South, but there was one thing different, and that was a television camera. And the footage of that attack was shown that night. ABC News broke in, interrupting the broadcast premiere of Judgment at Nuremberg to show what became known as Bloody Sunday. And then a fascinating 8-day period unfolded, because in the usual way the story is told, you go from the scene on the bridge to Lyndon Johnson standing in the well of the House of Representatives saying, and we shall overcome. But that was 8 days. And in those 8 days, Lyndon Johnson did something pretty remarkable. He enforced, he got Wallace in line. He also got King and the civil rights activists to acknowledge the authority of the courts. So he got Wallace to acknowledge the rule of law, and he got the civil rights folks to acknowledge the rule of law. He had everything in place, and then he steps in and says that the time has come for voting rights to be secured in the United States. And it's one of the great pieces of presidential literature written by Dick Goodwin, who was a little hungover. He was upset he had not been assigned the speech in the beginning, and so he'd gone out and had a fairly liquid evening, then came in. The first draft was terrible. They asked Goodwin to do it. And that speech, which echoes even now, is one of the great pieces of presidential rhetoric written totally on deadline. In the 8 days between Bloody Sunday and the speech to Congress, Johnson made both George Wallace and the civil rights activists submit to the authority of the courts that were supervising the march. He made both acknowledge that there was a rule of law. So he created a kind of balance, an equipoise. And then he came in really on the side of the activists. George Corley Wallace of Alabama from Barber County used to chew on White Owl cigars, which is not a good kind of cigar. He was a fairly progressive, non-virulently racist Democrat until he lost a couple of elections, and then became the segregationist we know him to have been. He was a populist. He understood the power of race among white voters, that white voters who might be poor would vote with white voters who might be rich because they would have a common foe in the African American world. Wallace said in his inauguration in Montgomery that he would support segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Wallace became the perfect enemy for both President Kennedy and President Johnson. He was the embodiment of this lost cause finding new energy in the Cold War. And ultimately, the breaking of Wallace was a huge breakthrough for the country. Wallace had been a fairly progressive Democrat. He lost an election. He decided he wanted, therefore, to be victorious. So he adopted segregation. He became a much more virulent racist candidate out of convenience. One of the important things to remember about George Wallace is he did very well outside the South. In 1968, 1972, 1964, he was a candidate who took a regional message to a national audience. And so if you're a Northerner or a Midwesterner or a Westerner and you want to look down on the South, check and see how well George Wallace did in your 1968 presidential race. He won 13.5% of the popular vote. Kind of amazing. 5 states, they were all southern states, but Wisconsin, Indiana, I mean, this was someone who had a message that was all too tragically American and not exclusively Southern. In January 1963, George Wallace stands in front of the Alabama Capitol in Montgomery and says, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And it was this cri de coeur from the heart of the Old South in a new world, in a world of the Cold War, a world of shifting identity. And it would not stand for long, but it was a powerful cry at that point and captured the fears of millions of people. I met Wallace once. It was about 1995 or 96. And of course, he was in a wheelchair after having been the assassination attempt in 1972. And we met in Montgomery. A lot of history in Montgomery, Alabama. There's the place where Jefferson Davis took the oath of office as president of the Confederacy. It's the place where Wallace stood and did his segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever speech. And Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, which of course is Dr. King's church, is not far away. We were down in that same sort of square. And Wallace at that point was quite old and frail in terms of the chair. But he was sitting in front of this quite heroic portrait of himself. And so you had this interesting conflict between the man as he was and the man as he wished to remember himself. And in many ways, that's true of the region he came to represent so clearly. Wallace had recanted a lot of his views. Some of it was convenient. He wanted to continue to win elections, and African Americans were now enfranchised. And so he's a great example of how do we deal with redemption in American life. Do you take him at his word or not? Everybody has to make a decision on that. The last speech Lyndon Johnson ever gave was at his library in Austin. He'd come from his ranch in Stonewall. There'd been a snowstorm. He was late. It was a civil rights symposium, and Johnson knew the end was near. He'd started smoking again. He started drinking. He was told by his doctors, never smoke again or you won't make it, and he didn't. But the speech he gave was about the centrality of civil rights as the American promise. And he said, I feel embarrassed that I've done so little, that I was not able to accomplish more, which is a remarkably open and candid assessment of what was otherwise what was in fact an incredible legacy. Why are we so divided now? There are a couple of thoughts. First of all, the 1850s were pretty bad, so let's not run too far ahead here. I think that one of the issues is the parties have become purer. That is, the Democratic Party had a segregationist wing and a Northern liberal wing. The Republicans had Midwestern conservatives, but New England progressives, Western conservatives. The parties have become more their essence. And so the parties don't play the filtering role they once did. Truman worried about this. Harry Truman said that he worried about the moment when all the liberals would be in one party and all the conservatives in another, because then you would have this stark choice and the other side wouldn't have any incentive to cooperate. I think the death of incentive for compromise is a key villain here. Voters don't reward those who vote according to what their minds tell them, as opposed to what their party caucus tells them. And I think some of this is on us. Lawmakers only hear, by and large, from the people who are upset. If you're pleased that your senator, your representative, voted with the other side on something with which you agreed, let them know. Now, you're probably not going to know that because that presumes a pretty detailed grasp of what's going on, which is unusual. But this is not brain surgery. Politicians are reactive. They are accountable. They are interested in pleasing you to make sure they continue in office. And if you want something different, you have to speak up. The work of the mid-1960s, the passage of the 64 Act, the passage of the 65 Act, really finishes a century that began with the Civil War of a huge part of the mainstream of the country not accepting a fundamental premise of equality. After 1965, it became very difficult for that to be a mainstream position. There are those who do, but 1865 to 1965 is a long, complicated story that ends well, or well enough, which is about all you can do in terms of history. By securing open public accommodation, by securing the right to vote, we in many ways managed to come as close as we've been able to leveling a playing field. And there's an immense amount of work to be done. And there's a lot that's happened since then of immense importance, unquestionably. But by and large, Lincoln would have recognized what by and large, Abraham Lincoln would have recognized what Lyndon Johnson did as finishing the work of the Civil War. And that's an extraordinary arc. By March 1968, Lyndon Johnson was bereft by the war in Vietnam. 47 Americans were dying a day in 1968 in Vietnam. The year had begun with Tet, the North Vietnamese offensive. Johnson realized that there was very little he could do while running for president and trying to negotiate an end to the war. He would have loved to have remained as president. He was certainly open to being drafted. But Eugene McCarthy, a Democrat from Minnesota, had come in, challenged him in the New Hampshire primary, done very well. Bobby Kennedy at that point had entered the race. So he had the challenges from the left and saw the writing on the wall. Seems to me the key thing for this particular era is to understand that it is difficult but not unique. The forces that are shaping the worst parts of us right now, isolationism, nativism, racism, extremism, are forces that are part of the American character. And that might be more depressing than you might want to think, but I think there's something somewhat liberating about knowing that we have faced these forces in the past, we have pushed them back, we have made progress. They're never permanently defeated. There's no such thing as a permanent victory. I think about the soul because I think that there are better angels here and our worst instincts here. There's Dr. King here and there's the Klan here. And every day is shaped by the struggle between these two forces. It's true of all of us, and it's true of the country as well. Now, we do better in America when we actually listen and try to use our brains as opposed to simply reacting with our guts. So we need to find some way to restore the role of reason. If I disagree with you 99% of the time, and so when you get up and say something, I think, oh, Jesus, here they go again. If I don't listen, then I'm not being true to the American Revolution. If you're a conservative, you should love this point because this is the original intent. The original intent of the country was that reason would take a stand with passion in the arena. So if you get up, you make your case, and I think, maybe they got a point. I'd argue that a lot of the best part of America happens when you say, maybe they have a point. And we don't say, maybe they have a point nearly enough right now. So we need to use our brains. We need to use reason. And we absolutely have to fight tribalism. We have to fight this instinct to pick one jersey or the other, pick one team or the other, and then the other team is just always wrong. Because I think we know in our own lives that's not true. I mean, maybe people think they're right all the time. I don't know anybody who does. The country was built by people who were willing to learn from their mistakes, who were willing to say, I got that one wrong. And if you can't do that, then you foreclose the possibility of ever learning, of ever moving ahead. If we had not been able to admit that we made a mistake on segregation, for instance, or how about this? If we had not been willing to admit that we had made a mistake in the 1930s and early 1940s by not actively opposing Adolf Hitler, if we hadn't admitted that, we wouldn't have won the Second World War. If we didn't admit that segregation was wrong, we would not be a freer and more just and better country. If we weren't willing to admit that slavery was wrong, we would have been hopelessly knocked out of modernity. What's the common denominator there? The common denominator is we looked the facts in the face and we thought, you know what we thought was true and good yesterday is not true and good today. And we used facts and we used reason. That's not a partisan point. It sounds partisan today, which tells you something, but it's not. Ronald Reagan was right about the Cold War. Franklin Roosevelt was right about Hitler in the end. There's a Republican, there's a Democrat. It's not about that party label. It's about the capacity to say, I want to live in a country that looks and feels like this.